He blasted rocks for a living. He collected cars like trophies. And he transformed a scrapyard in rural Canada into one of Netflix's most beloved restoration shows. Mike Hall, Rust Valley's own Rasta Blasta, won fans over because he chased his passion with everything he had, even when the math never worked in his favor. But while we watched the joy of bringing old steel back to life, Mike was quietly buried under stress, mounting bills, and the harsh truth of running a dream like a business. So when he suddenly held a massive auction and cleared out hundreds of cars, fans everywhere were left asking the same thing. What happened to Mike Hall? Why walk away from the very thing that made him who he is? Stay tuned to find out. Mike Hall, famously known as the Rasta Blaster, was the kind of man who lived life full throttle both on the job and off it. Born in 1956 in St. Boniface, Manitoba, Canada, Mike's early years were pretty ordinary until his dad landed a job with the Canadian Pacific Railway. That move took the family west to Kamloops, British Columbia, where Mike's lifelong fascination with cars began to take shape. From a young age, he was hooked. By the time he hit 20, he was already collecting cars, especially muscle cars, the kind that roared and rumbled like nothing else. He often said his love for them was in his DNA. Growing up in the 1960s, surrounded by that raw power and style, he became addicted to the thrill of fast cars, a passion that would follow him for life. When Mike struck out on his own, he didn't jump straight into the car world. Instead, he founded a company called Chimera Springs Rockworks Limited, where he made his name as a rock blaster. It was dangerous, high adrenaline work. Exactly the kind of challenge Mike thrived on. His job was all about drilling, scaling, and blasting rocks to stabilize steep slopes, especially along tricky stretches of road where landslides could spell disaster. As Mike liked to say, he spent years hanging from cliffs and blowing things up. The company thrived and Mike made a solid fortune in the construction business. But anyone who knew him also knew exactly where a lot of that money went. Straight into his ever-growing collection of vintage and muscle cars. While he was out on the road blasting rocks for Chimera Springs Rockworks, his jobs took him all over British Columbia. And in every small town or hidden back road he visited, he'd spot some old forgotten car that most people would drive past without even noticing. But not Mike. To him, every rusted shell was a sleeping beauty, just waiting for its second chance. He was away from home about 10 months a year. And with the kind of money he was earning, he didn't think twice about buying cars wherever he found them. Getting them home was another story. Sometimes he'd haul them back on trailers. Other times he'd squeeze them into dump trucks or use whatever vehicle could get the job done. That spark for collecting actually began long before his blasting career back when he was just a kid in Kamloops. As the years rolled on, that hobby turned into something much bigger. Mike's collection grew so fast he eventually bought a 26-acre farm just to store his ever-rolling fleet. Before long, hundreds of old cars and trucks filled the land, like a graveyard of Canadian automotive history. But even the most patient spouse has limits. His wife finally told The farm couldn't double as an auto yard anymore. So Mike came up with a plan. He bought a 5-acre property in Tappan, perfectly zoned for auto wrecking, and set up shop right next to the White Post Auto Museum. He even struck a deal to store some of his vehicles on the museum grounds. It was a car collector's dream setup and a perfect excuse to keep buying. Over the decades, his collection ballooned to nearly 400 cars. What started with a handful in his 20s turned into hundreds by his 60s. He joked that it was an addiction, one that kept getting harder to manage. At some point, Mike began wondering what would happen to it all when he was gone. With his father having passed away at 60, and many of his friends facing health issues, he realized his own time might be limited. The question hit hard. What would his wife and kids do with 400 cars sitting in a field? That thought pushed him to act. In 2016, he listed the entire property, cars included, for $1.19 million. But surprisingly, no one bid. A year later, frustrated but undeterred, he raised the price to $1.45 million. And honestly, the offer was more than fair. The deal included the 5-acre property already zoned for auto salvage, plus a renovated home, a 900 feet restoration shop, and a larger one, 200 FT steel building. He even threw in enough steel beams and rafters to build another 8,000 square feet of covered workspace. And of course, there were the cars, more than 340 classic vehicles, each worth anywhere from a few hundred to tens of thousands. He couldn't even say for sure how many there were. Since first listing the property, he'd added at least 40 more. They lined the fields like a crowd frozen in time, quiet and weathered, waiting for someone to bring them roaring back to life. When asked why he was letting it all go, Mike gave a simple reason. He had planned to restore them all in retirement, but life had other ideas. A massive 5-year rock scaling contract landed in his lap, pushing retirement even further down the road. And at 60 years old, he knew the clock wasn't exactly on his side. Rebuilding all those cars just wasn't realistic anymore. Selling the property, though, turned out to be its own challenge. Winter buried the yard under 6 feet of snow, and buyers weren't exactly lining up to dig through a frozen sea of old metal. But his real estate agent, Hudson Purba from Century 21 Desert Hills, really never lost hope. To him, this wasn't just a sale. It was a rare chance for someone to step into a dream surrounded by history in one of the most stunning corners of British Columbia. Eventually, the story began spreading like wildfire. Headlines popped up about an older Canadian man selling hundreds of classic cars along with his land. Collectors from around the world took notice. Individual car orders started rolling in. And soon, television producers caught wind of the story. You see, Mike had already appeared on the hit Canadian series Highway Through Hell, where he'd shown off his blasting skills by clearing dangerous boulders off the roads. The director of that show, Matt Shook, remembered him well. So when news started spreading about a wild car collector in British Columbia trying to sell a property filled with hundreds of vintage vehicles, Matt immediately thought of Mike. Show along with fellow producer Tyson Hepburn, both from Mayhem Entertainment, saw a golden opportunity. Mayhem was already known for creating some of Canada's most successful factual TV series, and Mike's eccentric charm practically screamed television gold. Matt reached out and pitched the idea. Straight. They wanted to build a show entirely around Mike, his cars, and his world in Tapin. At that point, Mike had been struggling to sell his property. Some say he agreed to the show simply because it gave him a new way to make use of what he already had. Others believe it was the perfect excuse not to sell at all. Either way, the timing couldn't have been better. The deal offered him a chance to do what he loved, restore cars and get paid for it. They filmed the pilot episode, and it didn't take long to impress the big players. Chorus Entertainment jumped on board almost immediately, ordering a full 8-part series. The show would spotlight not just Mike and his team, but also the vibrant, tight-knit car culture of the shoe swap region. The result was Rust Valley Restorers, a joint production between Mayhem Entertainment and Big Time Decent Productions Incorporated. It premiered on December 6, 2018. And right from the start, it struck a chord with audiences. Viewers couldn't get enough of Mike's energy. With his wild dreadlocks, larger-than-life personality, and unshakable passion for cars, he stood out from the usual reality TV crowd. He wasn't just another mechanic. He was a character. Someone who loved every beat-up old car like it was family. His determination, even when it clashed with common sense or profit, made for addictive television. But here's the thing. By the time Mike Hall started filming the very first season of Rust Valley Restorers, he was already in his 60s. He knew the clock was ticking, and those hundreds of classic cars scattered across his property weren't getting any younger. Each one had the potential to be worth a fortune if restored, but only if he took action. So, instead of watching them slowly decay, Mike made a bold move. He turned his lifelong passion into a real business. That's how Rust Brothers was born. Now, at first glance, it might sound like just another auto restoration shop, but Mike and his crew had a different vision. They weren't chasing high-end showpieces or million-dollar collector cars. Their goal was to bring back vehicles that regular folks could afford, cars that people could actually drive and enjoy. Of course, that kind of mission wasn't exactly a recipe for easy profit. But Mike didn't care. He called up his closest friends and local car enthusiasts, people who shared his obsession, and together they got to work. The shop itself sat in a place Mike nicknamed his Field of Dreams, tucked between the Rocky Mountains and the desert, a spot known to locals as Rust Valley. It was a car lover's paradise and the perfect backdrop for the show. Each episode followed Mike, his best friend Avery Skay, and his son Connor Hall as they hunted through the yard for their next project. Mike often teased Avery, calling him the muscle car expert of the team, and for good reason. The man could tear down and rebuild a vintage car faster than most people could change their oil. Alongside their own finds, the team also restored vehicles for other classic car owners, keeping their hands in their schedules. Constantly full. But here's where things got tricky. Mike was used to doing big restorations with no budget limits. Running a tight, cost-conscious shop was new territory. As a result, he quickly found himself overspending on almost every project. Despite the show's growing popularity, the business side of things wasn't going so smoothly. He admitted that he was losing money on most of his builds, saying he'd only ever broken even on 2 cars. Take the 1966 Lincoln Continental, for example. The plan was to keep the restoration under $15,000 and flip it for a profit. But costs spiraled way beyond that. And when the car was finally ready, finding a buyer willing to pay the right price was almost impossible. The same story repeated itself with his beloved Chevelle SS 396. Mike had hoped for $25,000, but had to settle for just $10,000. Barely enough to keep the lights on. And while Mike was driven by passion, his son Connor was all about practicality. Connor constantly reminded his dad that every dollar spent had to make sense. He wasn't shy about pointing out poor decisions either, like when Mike dropped $2,000 on a metal forming brake just for that same Lincoln. In the end, it was Connor who pushed to sell the car at a loss, arguing that it was better to move on than to sink even deeper. Then came one of their toughest builds yet, a 1963 Continental convertible. What was supposed to be a $17,000 restoration ended up costing a staggering $50,000. Mike explained it best. Filming a reality show slows everything down. With cameras around, production takes longer. Mistakes cost more, and efficiency goes out the window. He estimated that the extra time and effort added about 30% more to every project, a loss he personally absorbed. But he didn't mind too much. He loved making people's dreams come true, even if it cost him. For Mike, one of the biggest challenges in running the business was the constant tension between estimates and quotes. An estimate was a rough guess, but a quote was a promise.